The war had been coming for years. The Selfar Dominion, a ruthless alien empire, had conquered countless planets, crushing entire civilizations under their rule. They believed in strength, in power, in absolute dominance. And now they had declared war on Earth. The Galactic Council held an emergency meeting. Every species in the universe had seen what the Selfar did to their enemies. No planet had ever survived their wrath. Earth was next. But instead of sending an army, Earth made a decision that shocked the universe. They sent one man, a single human, Captain James Hunter. The Selfar commanders laughed when they heard the news. Was this some kind of joke? A single soldier against their massive war fleet, against their genetically enhanced warriors, against their planet-destroying weapons. This is not war, Supreme Commander Valzok sneered. This is an insult. Still, as arrogant as the Selfar were, they would not ignore a challenge. If Earth wanted to play games, they would crush this human in front of the entire galaxy. They would make an example out of him. The battlefield was set. A war-torn planet on the edge of the galaxy, known as Delta V3. The Selfar forces gathered in the thousands. Warships hovered in the sky, ready to fire. Tanks rolled across the wasteland, and their elite warriors, the Voidborn, prepared to strike. And then he arrived. A single human. James Hunter stepped onto the battlefield alone. No armor, no visible weapons, just a calm expression on his face, as if he had already won. The Selfar generals watched from their command station, their expressions filled with amusement. What is he doing? One of them scoffed. Meditating, praying. Commander Valzok smirked. Let's see how long his bravery lasts. He gave the order. Capture him. A squad of 10 elite Voidborn soldiers advanced. Each one was nearly 8 feet tall, their bodies covered in thick, black armor. Their weapons hummed with lethal energy. They were the finest warriors in the galaxy, trained for decades in the art of war. But James did not move. As the soldiers got closer, something strange happened. One by one, the warriors froze in place. Their weapons dropped from their hands. Their eyes widened in terror. They tried to move. They couldn't. Something was holding them. Something unseen, unstoppable. From the command station, the Selfar general stared in confusion. What was this? Some kind of human trick. Valzok's smirk faded. Send more, he ordered. Another wave of warriors charged at James. They got within 10 feet. Then they stopped, paralyzed. James finally moved. He took a single step forward. The warriors collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. Their bodies trembled with an unknown force, as if reality itself had shifted around them. The Selfar commanders exchanged nervous glances. This was not normal. This is impossible, one of them muttered. Valzok clenched his fists. Fire. 100 blaster rifles pointed at James. A storm of plasma fire erupted toward him. James raised his hand. The plasma bolts stopped. They hung in the air, frozen like time itself had been interrupted. Then, with a flick of his fingers, James sent them back. The Selfar soldiers were thrown backward as their own weapons turned against them. Explosions rocked the battlefield. From the command station, silence filled the air. The Selfar generals were no longer laughing. Valzok's face twisted in rage. He slammed his fist on the table. What is he? James took another step forward. The ground beneath him cracked. The Selfar forces, thousands of them, felt something they had never felt before. Fear. James Hunter looked up at the warships in the sky. He raised a single finger, pointing toward them. The battleships shut down. Engines failed. Lights flickered out. Massive war machines fell from the sky, crashing into the ground like broken toys. The Selfar commanders could barely breathe. This was no human. This was something else, something far more terrifying. James finally spoke. His voice was calm, cold. Surrender. The Selfar had expected an easy victory. They had expected to wipe out humanity in a single battle. They had expected weakness. They were wrong. And as James Hunter took another step forward, they realized the war had already ended. The battlefield lay in ruins. Smoke and fire covered the land. The wreckage of Selfar warships scattered like fallen leaves. The once mighty alien warriors trembled in disbelief. James Hunter stood in the middle of it all, untouched, unshaken. He had barely moved, yet he had shattered the strongest army in the galaxy. Inside the Selfar command station, chaos erupted. Alarms blared. Commanders shouted orders that no one could follow. Screens flickered with reports. Weapons offline. Warships down. Troops refusing to fight. Supreme Commander Valzok clenched his fists. His entire fleet, his unstoppable force, was falling apart. Because of one man. "This is impossible," General Xithek muttered, his claws clicking against the metal table. What kind of weapon is he?" Valzok's golden eyes burned with fury. "He's not a weapon. He's something else." His voice dropped to a whisper, "And I want to know what." With a single motion, he activated the Overseer drones, silent, invisible machines that scanned every molecule, every heartbeat, every movement of James Hunter. He had to have a weakness. Back on the battlefield, James took another step. The Selfar soldiers flinched. These warriors, who had conquered thousands of worlds, were now afraid to even breathe in his presence. One soldier, barely able to control his shaking hands, raised his weapon. A desperate act. James turned his gaze toward him. The soldier froze. His eyes widened as if he could see something that no one else could. He let out a strangled gasp and dropped his rifle, stumbling backward. James said nothing, but the message was clear. There was no fight left. A distant boom shook the sky. From the Selfar flagship, something massive launched, a hypersonic annihilator bomb, capable of reducing a planet's surface to dust. It roared through the atmosphere, headed straight for the battlefield. A final act of desperation. James didn't look up. He simply raised his hand. The bomb, moving at speeds faster than sound, stopped midair. Gasps rippled through the Selfar ranks. Impossible. That bomb had enough kinetic force to tear through an entire continent. And yet, it hovered, frozen, as if time itself refused to let it fall. James exhaled. With a flick of his wrist, the bomb reversed direction. It shot back toward the Selfar flagship. Inside the command center, warning lights blared. Valzok barely had time to react. The impact shook the heavens. A blinding explosion swallowed the flagship. Fire and metal rained from the sky as the Selfar's greatest warship was wiped from existence. Silence followed. Then, a sound that no one had ever heard from the Selfar army before. Surrender. One by one, the soldiers dropped their weapons. Knees hit the ground. They were defeated, not by an army, not by a weapon, but by one human. Inside the crumbling remains of the command station, Valzok's breathing was heavy. His golden armor was scorched. His empire, his legacy, was collapsing. And yet, as he stared at the battlefield, he felt something strange. Not just fear. Curiosity. Who was this human? Where did he come from? And more importantly, what was he becoming? James Hunter turned his gaze toward the last remaining Selfar forces. His eyes, calm, unshaken, seemed to pierce through reality itself. The war was over, but something bigger had just begun. The battlefield was silent. The air smelled of smoke and melted metal. The once mighty Selfar forces, feared across the galaxy, were on their knees, staring in horror at the lone human who had undone their entire war machine in a single day. James Hunter stood in the middle of the wreckage, his expression unreadable. The glow of distant fires reflected in his eyes, but he didn't seem impressed by the destruction. He simply waited. Above him, the Selfar fleet was in chaos. The command bridge of the remaining warships crackled with urgent voices. alien officers scrambling for answers that didn't exist. Their supreme commander, Valzok, was gone, destroyed in the very explosion meant to eliminate James. Now, that Selfar forces had no leader, no strategy, no hope. Somewhere deep within the surviving warships, a young Selfar officer named Rekath clenched his claws. Unlike the others, he wasn't paralyzed by fear. He was watching, studying. "What is he?" another officer whispered. Rekath didn't answer immediately. He focused on the human below, the way he carried himself, unbothered, untouched, as if none of this was surprising to him. "This is not normal," Rekath muttered. "Humans, they're supposed to be weak. Then why can't we defeat him?" Rekath's mandibles clicked in frustration. He didn't know. No one did. He turned back to the scanners. The human's vitals were stable. No cybernetic enhancements, no genetic modifications, no energy field shielding him. By all logic, James Hunter should have been just another fragile life form. And yet, he had crushed an empire. Suddenly, movement flickered across the screen. James looked up. Rekath felt his stomach drop. There was no way Hunter could see him. Not through the thick layers of reinforced metal, not through the cloaked observation drones. And yet, James was staring directly at him. A strange feeling crawled up Rekath's spine, something he had never experienced before. Not fear, something worse. Recognition. It was as if James Hunter knew exactly who he was. Before Rekath could react, the warship's lights flickered. The control panels sparked. Alarms blared through the bridge. The ship was losing power. Impossible. An engineer choked. "The reactors are still functional. Something is draining our energy." Rekath's claws tightened. He turned back to the battlefield. James Hunter hadn't moved. But somehow, the ship's systems were collapsing because of him. "Evacuate," Rekath ordered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now." "But sir," Rekath slammed his fist on the panel. "No." The Selfar officers scrambled, abandoning their posts, rushing toward the escape pods. The warship trembled, the metal groaning as power bled away into nothingness. Rekath was the last to leave. As the escape pod doors sealed shut, he caught one final glimpse of James Hunter standing alone in the destruction. The ship's lights died completely. Then, in a single, soundless collapse, it was gone. Not exploded, not broken into debris, simply erased from existence. Rekath's heart pounded as his escape pod sped away, the battlefield shrinking beneath him. What had they just witnessed? The Selfar had ruled for centuries. They had crushed civilizations, wiped out entire species, and bent the galaxy to their will. And now, all it had taken was one human to end them. Rekath didn't know if it was fear or admiration burning inside him, but he did know one thing. This wasn't over. The escape pod shot through the darkness of space, carrying Rekath and the few remaining Selfar officers far from the wreckage of their fallen fleet. The silence inside the small vessel was suffocating. No one spoke. No one dared. They had all seen it, a warship vanishing without a trace, not destroyed, not broken, just erased. Rekath's claws gripped the armrest tightly as he stared at the screen displaying the battlefield behind them. The human was still there, standing in the ruins of an empire that should have been invincible. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't reacting. He simply watched, as if he had expected this outcome all along. One of the officers finally broke the silence. "We need to warn the High Council." His voice was barely above a whisper. "They have to know what happened." Rekath's mandibles twitched. Warn them? What could they do? The Selfar were conquerors, rulers of 1,000 worlds, but today they had learned a bitter truth. They had no idea what they were up against. Still, he nodded. Set course for the nearest command station. The pod's engines roared to life, and the Selfar fled into the void, leaving behind the battlefield, their pride, their empire, everything. Far below, James Hunter finally moved. He took a slow breath, his eyes scanning the empty sky, where the last Selfar ships had disappeared. He knew they would return. They always did. But this time, things would be different. The war was over. Now, the real fight was about to begin. Deep within the Selfar homeworld, the High Council gathered in a massive chamber, their dark golden robes flowing as they sat in a circle of towering thrones. The room was carved from obsidian, the walls glowing with ancient inscriptions, the laws of conquest, the legacy of their supremacy. But now, that legacy was in question. Rikath knelt before them, his head lowered, his body trembling with the weight of his report. "You are certain?" One of the counselors demanded, his voice cold. "One human?" Rikath nodded. He did not use weapons. No fleet. No army. And yet, he swallowed. He defeated us. Completely. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Some scoffed. Others exchanged uneasy glances. The High Chancellor, an ancient Selfar with deep silver markings on his skin, leaned forward. "Describe him." Rikath hesitated. He was ordinary. The words felt ridiculous leaving his mouth. No enhancements. No armor. Just human. Laughter erupted from one of the younger council members. A single primitive destroyed an entire fleet. This is madness. Rikath clenched his jaw. He understood their disbelief. He barely believed it himself, but he had seen it. "He is human," he admitted, "but he is not like the others." The room fell silent. The High Chancellor's golden eyes narrowed. "Then what is he?" Rikath didn't have an answer. But before he could speak, the chamber lights flickered. A deep, unnatural cold settled over the room. The air felt wrong. Then, for the first time in the history of the Selfar Empire, the war alarm screamed. A bright red signal flashed over the chamber, a sound that had never been heard within the walls of the High Council. It was the highest level of emergency, a threat not just to a fleet, but to the entire homeworld. The council members turned sharply to the large viewing screen that had activated at the center of the room. What they saw made their blood freeze. A tear had opened in the void of space, just above their homeworld. A dark rift, shimmering and pulsing with an energy they did not understand. And stepping through it, James Hunter, alone, unarmed, descending toward the planet as if gravity itself had chosen to obey him. The Selfar had always been the ones to invade, the ones to strike fear into the hearts of civilizations. But now, for the first time ever, they were the ones being invaded. Rikath could only watch as the human approached. There was no fleet backing him, no reinforcements. And yet, it felt like the end of everything they knew. The capital city of Selfarn was a marvel of alien engineering. Towering spires of obsidian pierced the sky, their surfaces shimmering with golden energy conduits. The streets below were filled with Selfar citizens, their insectoid forms moving in perfect synchronization, following the rigid hierarchy that had ruled their empire for millennia. But today, the streets were filled with something else. Panic. Air raid sirens howled across the skyline. Military transports roared overhead. The elite Selfar war guard, clad in dark armor, rushed toward the central command fortress. Something was coming, something that had never happened before. The High Council chamber had descended into chaos. Rikath stood frozen as the holographic display continued to show the impossible. James Hunter, the lone human who had wiped out their fleet, was descending toward their homeworld without a ship. "Activate planetary defenses," one of the counselors roared. "Scramble the orbital fleet," another ordered. The High Chancellor stood, his golden robes flowing as he raised a clawed hand. Silence. The chamber fell still. The Chancellor's glowing yellow eyes locked onto Rikath. "You survived. You fought him. Tell us, how do we kill him?" Rikath's mandibles twitched. He wished he had an answer. Instead, he whispered, "I don't know if we can." The Chancellor's expression darkened. He turned to the war commanders. Deploy everything. And so the might of the Selfar Empire moved as one, preparing for war. Above the planet, the skies burned. The Selfar orbital fleet, a massive armada of 1,000 warships, opened fire. Energy cannons lit up the void, unleashing waves of plasma strong enough to melt entire continents. Hyper-missiles streaked toward their lone target, each one capable of turning the city to dust. It didn't matter that it was just one human. They would unleash the full fury of their empire upon him. And yet, none of it touched him. James Hunter walked through the fire, untouched, unharmed. The plasma blasts curved away from him, dissipating into the void. The missiles exploded before they could reach him, as if they had struck an invisible barrier. Panic spread through the Selfar fleet. "He's blocking our weapons," a commander shouted. "That's impossible," another screeched. But it wasn't impossible. It was happening. And then, James raised his hand. A shockwave erupted from his body, tearing through the fleet like a storm of pure destruction. Selfar warships shattered instantly. One by one, they disintegrated, not exploded, not wrecked, erased from existence, as if they had never been there at all. The greatest fleet in the history of the Selfar Empire, gone in a single instant. The capital city trembled. In the command fortress, fear took hold. Rakath watched the battle unfold in real time, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. They had always been the superior species. They had conquered thousands of worlds. And yet, here they were, powerless before a single human. A deep rumbling shook the fortress. "He's here." The words came from one of the guards, his voice shaking. The Selfar turned toward the massive doors of the High Council chamber. Then, a deep resonating boom echoed through the fortress. The walls cracked. The golden conduits flickered. Another boom. The reinforced doors buckled. A third boom. The doors shattered inward. And there he stood. James Hunter stepped into the chamber, his expression calm, his movements slow. Controlled. Not an invader. Not a conqueror. Something else. The war guards raised their weapons. James lifted a single finger, and they vanished. Not killed, not obliterated, just gone. The High Council stood frozen in terror. For the first time in their history, they were not rulers. They were prey. The High Chancellor stepped forward, forcing his voice to remain steady. "What are you?" James stared at him for a long moment. Then he spoke. "The consequence." The High Council trembled. James took another step forward, and the empire of the Selfar fell. The once mighty empire of the Selfar stood at the edge of extinction. Their fleets were gone. Their armies had crumbled. The war, which they had once believed to be a mere conquest of a weaker species, had turned into their worst nightmare. And now, in the heart of their capital, in the grand chamber where they had once ruled the galaxy, they stood before the one being they could not defeat, James Hunter. He had done the impossible. He had defied the laws of war, of physics, of reality itself. A single human had brought an empire to its knees. The High Chancellor, his golden robes torn and his face filled with fear, dared to speak. Why? His voice was barely a whisper. James looked at him, his expression unreadable. The room was silent except for the distant sound of fires burning, of the planet itself groaning under the weight of devastation. "Because," James said finally, his voice calm, "you thought you were untouchable." The Chancellor flinched. "You came to our world. You burned our cities. You slaughtered our people like we were nothing." James took a step forward, and the Selfar Council instinctively shrank back. "You treated us as insects, and now when the consequence of your actions stands before you, you ask why." The Chancellor fell to his knees. His mandibles trembled. "We surrender." A ripple of gasps ran through the remaining council members. Some of them turned to flee, only to find that the doors had sealed shut. James tilted his head. You think surrendering means survival? The Chancellor's breath hitched. Please, mercy. James was silent. His gaze swept over the room, over the creatures who had orchestrated the deaths of billions, who had laughed as human worlds burned, who had taken everything. A quiet hum filled the air. The counselors began to scream. Not from pain, not from an attack, but because something was happening. Their minds were unraveling. They felt it. Every life they had destroyed, every world they had crushed, every scream, every cry, every desperate plea for mercy that had gone unheard. Now, they heard them all. It wasn't just memories, it was real. They could feel the terror, the helplessness, the agony of every being they had ever wronged. And it was too much. One by one, they collapsed. Some clawed at their own faces, their minds unable to contain the weight of their sins. Others whispered apologies, their bodies convulsing as the truth consumed them. The High Chancellor was the last to fall. His golden eyes flickered with realization. True, terrible realization, before he let out a single, choked sob. And then, the chamber fell silent. James turned away. He could have killed them. He could have erased them from existence, just as easily as they had done to others. But death would have been too kind. Instead, they would live with the weight of what they had done. They would never forget, and neither would the galaxy. James stepped outside. The city lay in ruins, but its people, the civilians, the innocent, stood watching. They had been raised on the belief that the Selfar were the apex, the rulers of the cosmos. Now, they saw the truth. James walked forward, the crowd parting for him. Some looked at him with fear, others with awe. A child, small and trembling, stepped forward. It was Selfar, but not yet hardened by war, not yet poisoned by conquest. It held out a tiny, clawed hand. James looked down at it, and after a moment, he knelt and extended his own. Their hands met. No words were spoken, but in that moment, something changed. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was not the end. Perhaps this was the beginning of something new. The war was over. The Selfar Empire, once a force that ruled the galaxy with cruelty and domination, had fallen. Their fleets, once numbering in the thousands, were reduced to scattered wreckage drifting in space. Their warriors, once feared, were now fugitives, too afraid to even utter the name of the one who had ended it all. James Hunter. He stood atop the ruins of what was once the grandest palace in the known universe. The same structure where, not long ago, Selfar generals had plotted the destruction of Earth. Now, it was nothing but shattered stone and broken glass, a monument to their downfall. And yet James felt no triumph, no victory, only silence. The galaxy had witnessed what a single human could do when pushed beyond the limits of reason, when justice turned into vengeance. The fear that humans had once felt, being the weakest among the stars, had now shifted. Now, the universe feared humanity. James turned as a figure approached. It was Admiral Kezrath, one of the last surviving leaders of the Selfar military. His once pristine armor was dented and scorched. His eyes, once filled with arrogance, now held something else entirely. Acceptance. It's done, the Selfar said, his voice hollow. We surrender completely. The Empire is no more. James studied him. The Selfar had no more fleets to fight with, no more weapons to wield. They had gone from conquerors to refugees in mere days. James reached into his coat and pulled out a small device, a communication beacon. With one press of a button, the fleets of Earth, waiting just beyond the system, would begin erasing the last remnants of the Selfar from existence. He hesitated. He could end it here, wipe away the last of those who had brought so much suffering. But then, what would he become? James looked beyond Kezrath, at the Selfar civilians who cowered in the ruins. The old, the weak, the children. They had never fought in this war. They had never burned a human city. Yet now, they were the ones who would pay the price. The silence stretched. Then, James did something no one expected. He dropped the beacon. The device shattered against the stone, its signal lost forever. Kezrath's eyes widened. You would let us live." James met his gaze, his voice steady. "Not for you. For them." He gestured to the civilians. "The war is over. What happens next? That's up to you." The Selfar admiral stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He had expected vengeance, annihilation. Instead, he had been given a choice. James turned, walking away. His ship waited just beyond the ruins, ready to take him home. He had done what no one thought possible. Not by destroying an empire, but by choosing to let it go. Because true victory was not in crushing your enemies. It was in proving that you were something greater.